My entitled neighbor tried to reserve my cat for her kid's birthday, and I want to tell you about the 3 weeks of escalation between when she first asked and when she finally accepted that the answer was no, because the 3 weeks contained some of the most baffling interactions I have ever had with a human being. My cat is named Pickle. Pickle is a calico. Pickle is 11 years old. Pickle is a deeply unsocial cat who does not like strangers, and who does not like being held by people other than me, and who specifically does not like children. Pickle has hidden under my bed for the entirety of every gathering I have ever hosted at my apartment for the last 10 years. My neighbor is named Susan. Susan moved into the apartment next to mine 8 months ago. Susan has a 6-year-old daughter named Brooklyn. Brooklyn had seen Pickle exactly once, which was when I was carrying Pickle in a carrier to the vet, and Brooklyn had been in the hallway with Susan and had said cat. Brooklyn had apparently developed an intense fixation on Pickle based on the brief encounter. Susan knocked on my door 3 weeks ago. I opened it. Susan said I have a favor to ask. Susan said Brooklyn's birthday is in 3 weeks. Susan said Brooklyn loves your cat. Susan said we are throwing Brooklyn a birthday party. Susan said I would like to reserve your cat for the party. I said excuse me. Susan said I would like to reserve your cat for the party. Susan said it the way you say things when you have rehearsed them and have decided that the request is reasonable, and you are simply asking. I said Susan, my cat does not interact with people. I said my cat does not even interact with me sometimes. I said my cat is not a party cat. Susan said I understand that some cats need preparation. Susan said I am giving you 3 weeks of notice so you can prepare your cat. I said Susan, my cat cannot be prepared. I said the answer is no. Susan said I see. Susan said let me think about this. Susan said I will get back to you. Susan went back to her apartment. I had said no. I had said no clearly. The conversation should have ended when I said no. But Susan had said let me think about this and I will get back to you. The think about this and get back to you was not a phrase you used after a no. The think about this and get back to you was a phrase you used after a maybe. I had not given Susan a maybe. Susan had heard a maybe. Susan was going to come back. Susan came back 2 days later. 2 days. Not a week. Not enough time for a normal person to sit with a no and accept it. Susan said I have been thinking. Susan said I would like to propose a compensation arrangement. I said excuse me. Susan said I would like to offer you $100 to bring your cat to the birthday party for 1 hour. I said Susan. Susan said 200. She jumped from 100 to 200 in the space of 1 second. She negotiated against herself. She heard me say her name and she read it as a counter. I had not countered. I had said her name because I was trying to find the words to tell her again that the answer was no. But Susan had a system running in her head where every sound I made was a signal in a negotiation, and she was adjusting her offer in real time. I said Susan, I am not negotiating. I said the answer is no. Susan said I understand that you may be hesitant. Susan said let me address your concerns. Susan said the party will be small. Susan said only 10 children. Susan said only 10 children, like 10 children was a small number of children to put in a room with an 11-year-old cat who does not like one child. Susan said Brooklyn will be very gentle. Susan said Brooklyn has been preparing herself. Susan said Brooklyn will know how to hold a cat by the time of the party. I want you to sit with that for a second because I sat with it. Brooklyn has been preparing herself. A 6-year-old child has been preparing herself to hold my cat. Susan had been coaching her daughter on cat handling in advance of a party that I had already said no to. Susan had taken my no and used the time after it to train her child to hold a cat that was never going to be at the party. I said Susan. I said my cat is not coming to a party. I said my cat is not for rent. I said my cat is not negotiable. I said this is the second time I have said no. I said please do not ask again. Susan said I understand. Susan said I appreciate your honesty. Susan said I understand the way people say I understand when they do not understand. Susan went back to her apartment. I closed my door. I told my husband Mark about the conversations. My husband said this is going to keep happening. I said yes. I said the strategy is to not engage. I said the strategy is to stop opening the door if she knocks. Susan knocked 4 days later. I did not open the door. Susan knocked again. I did not open the door. Susan called through the door. Susan said I know you are home. Susan said I want to talk to you about the cat. I sat on my couch and I looked at Pickle. And Pickle was still asleep because Pickle does not care about knocking or about Susan or about anything that is not Pickle. Then I heard something slide across the floor. An envelope. The envelope said for you. I picked up the envelope. I opened the envelope. The envelope contained a printed contract. 3 pages. The contract was titled Feline Birthday Engagement Agreement. I want you to read that title again. Feline Birthday Engagement Agreement. Someone had typed those words. Someone had decided that those words in that order made sense. The contract had real terms. The date and time of the party. The duration of the cat's appearance, which was listed as 90 minutes. Compensation in the amount of $300, which was $100 more than the $200 she had offered at my door, which meant Susan was still negotiating against herself even in writing. There was a clause about handling. There was a clause about photography rights. There was a clause about liability. The contract had 2 signature lines at the bottom. One for me, one for Susan. Susan had already signed her line. She had signed a contract for the rental of my cat before I had agreed to rent my cat. Susan had taken my 2 clear verbal refusals and had decided that the problem was not that I was saying no. The problem was that the deal was not formal enough. I called Mark in. Mark looked at the contract. Mark said this is incredible. Mark said this is a real contract. Mark said this is a piece of paper she has prepared specifically for the rental of our cat. I said yes. Mark said what are you going to do? I said I am going to write her a letter. Mark understood. The door was not working. Silence was not working. Verbal conversations were not working because Susan was not hearing verbal conversations. Susan was hearing negotiations. The only thing I had not tried was putting it in writing. Real writing. Not a contract, not terms, not a counteroffer, a letter. I sat down at the table with a pen and a piece of paper and I started writing. I wrote Susan's name at the top. I wrote Susan. I wrote I have received your contract. I wrote I am writing to tell you that the contract is not going to be signed because my cat is not for rent. I read what I had written. It was not enough because Susan had been hearing the simple version and converting it into something else. So I needed to say the thing underneath the thing. I wrote I am also writing to tell you that the framing of this exchange has been a problem for me. I wrote you have been operating as if my saying no was a negotiating position. I wrote it was not a negotiating position. I wrote it was a no. I wrote there is no no version of this exchange in which my cat is going to be at your daughter's birthday party. I sat with that line. There is no version. I wanted Susan to understand that. The word no had been living in every conversation I had had with Susan for the past 2.5 weeks, and Susan had been walking around it like it was furniture. I was putting it in the middle of the page where she could not walk around it. I wrote, please do not ask again. I wrote, please do not slide more documents under my door. I wrote, if you do, I will be writing to the building management about the pattern. I wrote that because Susan had been operating in a world where asking again had no cost. There was only cost to me, so I put a cost on it. Building management, not a threat, a consequence. Then I wrote the part I had been thinking about most. I wrote, I am sorry your daughter is going to be disappointed. I wrote, the cat does not exist for her birthday. I wrote, my cat exists for the cat and for me. That was the thing Susan had not understood. Susan had been looking at Pickle and seeing something that could be booked. Susan had been looking at my cat and seeing a service. And I needed Susan to understand that Pickle was not a service. Pickle was a living thing that belonged to herself and to me, and that was it. I wrote, I am asking you to receive this as the final answer. I wrote, I am asking you to talk to your daughter about the difference between things you can have and things that are not yours to ask for. I meant that line not just for Brooklyn, but for Susan. Susan was the one who had been asking for something that was not hers to ask for. I wrote, I am asking you to not contact me about this again. I wrote, I hope your daughter has a wonderful birthday. I signed it. I read the whole letter. Every line said no. Every line said no in a different way. The letter was not mean. The letter was not angry. The letter was clear. I folded the letter. I put it in an envelope. I walked to Susan's door. I bent down and I slid the envelope under Susan's door. I used her delivery system, but I used it to say the opposite of what she had been saying. She had slid a contract under my door that said, let's make a deal. I slid a letter under her door that said, there is no deal. There has never been a deal. There will never be a deal. 2 days passed. Quiet. No knock. No envelope. I knew I was waiting. I did not like that I was waiting. I did not like that Susan had put me in a position where silence in my own apartment felt like the calm before something. On day 3, Susan knocked on my door. My whole body went tight. I sat there. I did not move. Susan did not say anything through the door this time. She just knocked, and then there was a pause, and then I heard it. The sound of paper sliding across the floor. I felt tired. I felt like I had written the clearest letter I had ever written in my life, and now there was another envelope on my floor, and it was going to be another contract. A revised version. A higher number on the compensation line. I picked it up. It was lighter than the last one. I could feel through the paper that there was one piece of paper inside. I opened it. It was handwritten. Susan's handwriting. The note said, I have read your letter. The note said, I am sorry for the misunderstanding. The note said, I will not ask again. The note said, I appreciate your patience. The note said, I hope we can be neighborly. The note was signed Susan. I read it again. I was looking for the catch. I was looking for the line where Susan said but. I was looking for the line where Susan said, however, I would like to propose one more option. There was no catch. There was no but. There was no however. There was just the note. 5 lines. Handwritten. I was not feeling victory. I was not feeling relief exactly. I was feeling something closer to recognition. Every other thing Susan had given me had been a version of her not hearing me. The first conversation was Susan not hearing my no. The second conversation was Susan not hearing my no and offering money. The contract was Susan not hearing my no and trying to formalize a deal that did not exist. But this note was Susan hearing me. Maybe not all the way, but enough to write I am sorry. Enough to write I will not ask again. Enough to stop. This was as close to a real apology as I was going to get from Susan, and I knew that. I accepted it. I did not write back. The exchange was over. A week later, I was carrying Pickle in her carrier to the vet for a routine appointment. I walked into the hallway and Susan and Brooklyn were standing there. Brooklyn saw the carrier. Brooklyn's whole face changed. Brooklyn said, cat. Susan looked at me. Susan looked at the carrier. I could see Susan deciding what to do. And then Susan did something I had not seen her do before. She parented. Susan said, Brooklyn, the cat is going to the vet. Brooklyn said, can I see the cat? Susan said, no, honey. Susan said, the cat is not for us to see. Susan said, let's go. She took Brooklyn's hand and she walked Brooklyn down the hallway toward the elevator. The cat is not for us to see. Susan had said that. Susan had taken the thing I had written in my letter about the difference between things you can have and things that are not yours to ask for, and she had turned it into something she could say to a 6-year-old. The cat is not for us to see. That was enough. I turned and went the other way toward the stairs. 3 steps down the stairwell, Pickle did something I had not heard her do before. Pickle hissed. Loud. A real hiss. Pickle had been sitting in that carrier the whole time. Pickle had seen Susan and Brooklyn through the mesh. Pickle had heard Brooklyn say cat. Pickle had apparently been holding it in. I looked down at the carrier and I said, good Pickle. I said exactly. We went to the vet. The vet said Pickle is a bit agitated today. I said Pickle has had a stressful 3 weeks. The vet said cats no. I said yes. I said cats no. Susan and Brooklyn moved out 4 months later. I do not know if it was related to the cat situation. I assume not. The new neighbors have a dog. The dog stays in their apartment. The new neighbors have not asked to reserve the dog for anything. I think about it sometimes. Most people do not ask to reserve other people's pets. Most people hear the word no and they understand that the word no means no. Susan was a specific case, and the case has resolved. That was the thing I learned. That boundaries work when you hold them. That no is a full sentence, but sometimes you have to say it in different ways before it lands. I had to match her escalation with my own. She brought money. I brought a firmer no. She brought a contract. I brought a letter. She kept pushing until I pushed back hard enough that there was nowhere left for her to push. And Pickle had been right about Susan from the beginning. That hiss in the hallway was Pickle's way of saying I told you so. The cat knew. The cat always knew.